What is up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you here today as we're talking about the nWo. Last night on the WWE Network, I checked out the Beyond the Ring documentary on the nWo titled nWo Revolution. This is one I haven't watched possibly since its release back in 2012. Back in 2012, I put this on my bottom 5 DVDs released that year. To me, honestly, this documentary was really let me down. I didn't really think it was really done that well. I think they used too much recycled footage, and I think maybe they just had a spot for a release, and they thought, hey, if we put something out on the nWo, it's going to sell. We've used Goldberg, we've used the best of WCW, the best of WCW pay-per-view matches, the best of Starrcade, the best of the World Heavyweight title. Let's just keep pumping out WCW footage because people keep buying it. I will say that, we have seen the 2002 interview from Eric Bischoff, where they have in the background, they're setting up for Monday Night Raw. We've been seeing this interview used over and over and over countless times since the Monday Night War released back in 2002. It's just been overplayed. It's outdated. The words that are about to come out of his mouth before they say it. You can't count this against WWE because they didn't really know what was going to be happening in the future. But if they would have just sat on this idea of having an nWo documentary for a year, Eric Bischoff would have been freed up. He did their own Eric Bischoff documentary, but he would have not been with TNA, and he could have came in for an interview. Hulk Hogan would have been freed up from TNA as well. They didn't bring him in to the company until WrestleMania 30, but they could have easily brought in Hogan for an interview as well, knowing that, you're going to have, Scott Hall, you're going to have Kevin Nash. They used the people that they could that were in the company that were still in WCW at the time. Booker T sat down for an interview. They brought back Vince Russo, which I believe was the first time that Russo was used on a WWE documentary, coming in and doing stuff, not with the company, but talking about what was going down at the time. The nWo, in my time, was one of the best wrestling angles that was ever done. They really hype up how big the nWo was when it first started with Hogan, with Nash, and with Hall. The questions about what was going to be going down. They talk about, at the Monday Night Wars, one of the things that Eric Bischoff and WCW was doing was they were just bringing in guys that had name value, and each and every week it was like somebody new was coming into the company and who was going to be there. And, as we sit here years later, and we look back at the people that almost joined the nWo, there was the Godfather, there was Davey Boy Smith, there was, the Hulk Hogan thing almost didn't go down, and Sting had to be the third man. There's this mystique that sort of follows it around. And for a lot of people during this Monday Night War time is when people first started finding wrestling news sites. I used to always go to the wrestlingheadlines.com, which was also known as Lords of Pain. I'm not sure if No DQ was running at the time, but I wasn't smart enough to have an Observer account at the time. So all of the news that I was getting was getting filtered out and sort of made into their own stories sometimes. But the one thing that I got from the nWo, the Revolution documentary, was the nWo ran too damn long. And just last week, I watched the Horseman documentary, Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen. And basically that was something that they talked about on there, is that when WCW got an idea and it worked, they were going to squeeze it dry no matter what they had to do and no matter how long it had to run. Arn Anderson and Ric Flair were a really good team, but sometimes it felt like, they were putting guys in the Horsemen like Paul Roma that were just to have a group, not really to have a real purpose or a function to what was going down. The nWo, when it was Hogan, Hall, and Nash, maybe you can even talk about having, DiBiase and Virgil in there. that made sense. But when you put guys in there like, Mr. Wall Street or Big Bubba Rogers, and you're sort of adding people to the group just to have people on the team that were going to lose, didn't really make sense. Adding guys like Buff Bagwell, adding guys like Conan to sort of elevate them from the places that they were in, from the American males and part of the Dungeon of Doom, bringing people out of the background and putting people into the forefront, could have made sense if they worked them into building them up to taking over the NWO. Putting somebody in there like the Giant didn't really make sense, because to me, honestly, the Giant was just sort of like the henchman that was in the background. He wasn't even the main big guy of the group. He always was, sort of played second banana to Kevin Nash. And he could have been somebody that WCW could have used on their side to, sort of even the odds and make it, believable. He could have been the guy that, the NWO had to find a way to take him out, because he, at that time, was only a year or 2 years into the business, still had a whole lot of, fresh ideas that they could have done with him. But instead, the NWO, first they had to take the title off the Giant. Then all of a sudden, within a month, he joins the group. Before World War III, he's out of the group and trying to go out on his own. Then, after a certain period of time, he just joins again. Didn't make any sense at all. It was almost like, whenever they didn't have an idea for him, just stick him back in the NWO and just let him go with there. It was a really good documentary, but at the same time, it really wasn't that great at all either. It just makes you wonder, when are they going to be doing another one to sort of cover this one up? The one good thing about the set is the matches that they packed with it. The Back in Black 2002 release, even though the documentary is better, it only has maybe 3 or 4 matches on it. This is a 2-disc Blu-ray, a 3-disc DVD set. You're going to honestly get, the biggest matches that the NWO were ever in. Instead of, one of the matches is just sort of tying in, the NWO coming to WWE. The one thing I didn't really get was the NWO Wolfpack. And I know that, honestly, they were still part of the NWO, but they were not looking to crush WCW. They were only looking to crush NWO Hollywood. But, when guys like Lex Luger, when guys like Sting joined the group, they were the guys from WCW that stood up against the NWO. And the way that, the NWO was portrayed was that it was its own organization. And for Sting and for Luger to jump ship didn't really make sense to me. And when the NWO came back together, when they did the Finger Poke of Doom, although people look at the Finger Poke of Doom as being, this horrible thing that happened in WCW history, that is when it just starts to get conjumbled. Maybe you should have had the NWO Elite, and you should have let the NWO Black and White with Kurt Hennig, Stevie Ray, Virgil, Mr. Perfect, just cut ties with those guys. Let them go out on their own, so you don't have those jobbers hanging around. And I know you had Thunder, and those guys had to, be on Thunder because the main guys from the NWO, they didn't want to do it. And that's all you had to do in WCW if you didn't want to work, was just say you didn't want to do it. But, from there, that would run its time, and then you would bring back the NWO 2000. They didn't really talk about this a whole lot, but what the heck was Bret Hart's purpose in the NWO to begin with? I don't honestly remember how he joined. He always wore a Hulk Hogan t-shirt, and I don't know if that was sort of like a way of holding Bret Hart down. Was sort of, waving in front of him this match that he really wanted to happen at SummerSlam 1990. I think he wanted it at SummerSlam 1993 for the championship, and he didn't get it. But I think that's when Hogan left the company too, or maybe that was 94. But they ended up having the match, on Nitro, and then it ended up just being a whole way of, screwing everybody over before War Games. I don't think we ever really got a real singles match between Bret and Hogan, and he talks about that a lot in his book. But it never really made sense, because Bret was the guy that came down, who made sure that Sting left the title with the title at Starrcade. He was the referee that made sure that the nWo didn't get their own show. I think he was the referee between the Scott Hall and Larry Zbyszko match at that same Starrcade. But then all of a sudden he just joins the group, and he's just in it. And he's even in it later with the nWo 2000, when it was Hall and Nash, Bret Hart, Jeff Jarrett, and then I think even the Harris brothers were in there. It just didn't make sense. When the nWo came to the WWE, it was a fresh, new idea that was going to breathe a whole lot of WCW, because the Invasion didn't really get the job done. Even that, people really wanted to cheer Hogan. They hadn't seen Hogan in so long since he left the company. They wanted to see it. And maybe it really would have worked if Nash didn't tear his quad with Nash, with Hall, with the Giant and X-Pac. But Hall was on his way out of the company as well. So when Vince killed the nWo, it made sense, and everybody got freed. The whole thing with Shawn Michaels and with Booker T, that was sort of a huge question mark. But nWo will always live on. Be one of the best groups that I ever saw in my lifetime. Got me to love WCW. Got me to change the channel from WWE, even though I always still really rooted for WWE to win the war, because that's who I grew up watching. This documentary to me honestly needs to be done over again, because of how much it misses and how much that is used footage that we've seen thousands of times. It could have been done a lot better. And this is honestly, in my mind, one of the worst, done documentaries that WWE's done. And it should be redone again.